and then you were executive director of the Milton Historical Society, which led you to develop the second program on Lincoln, slavery, and the Jeffersonian dilemma.
Yeah, when Jefferson was an interesting character, and he shows up a lot in my research and what I was interested in. And one of the things that he could never quite resolve was the dilemma of American slavery. He was enough of a philosopher and a thinker to understand that it was morally wrong to hold people in bondage who have done nothing wrong other than be born in the wrong skin color. And he was enough of a Southerner and a Virginian that he couldn't figure out how to get out of it. So he had this situation where the country that he fought, he didn't literally fight as a soldier, but he was very involved in the creation of the United States. The country that he helped create is founded on this thing that's absolutely wrong. I mean, slavery is the foundation of a lot of the wealth. It's the foundation of a lot of the economy.
Especially in agricultural society.
Yeah, cotton was sort of the big thing by the time you get into the early 1800s. Tobacco prior to that. It's morally wrong, but there's no way he can figure out how to get out of it. And at one point he said something along the lines of that if push ever came to shove, there's no attribute of a just God that could side with the United States.
So he felt that by having slavery, we were fundamentally wrong to begin with.
Fundamentally wrong, and it had to be corrected, but he couldn't figure out a way to correct it that wasn't worse than doing the wrong.
Why is it an important dilemma?
If you realize your country is founded on, in some sense, this evil, which slavery is. I mean, slavery is evil. I don't think you find anybody who will argue against that. But it's so deeply entrenched in American history that it's hard to figure out a way to get rid of it without completely undoing a lot of what the country was at the time.
Isn't it about leadership?
In a sense, leaders can only lead so far. I mean, if you get too far out in front, they shoot you in the back. So you can only lead people X amount of distance. And what he said was, look, this is wrong. We need to figure out a way to solve it. I can't figure out a way to solve it. And the only way I can figure out a way to solve it is that it's going to end up in conflict. He felt it would end up in a race war. He was enough of a 18th century man to believe that his side would win, but he saw that as a tragedy anyway.
Even though he lived in, now we're talking about almost 19th century, but he was still an 18th century.
Well, he was formed as an 18th century gentleman. That's
Locke
how we
and
thought.
All the influences that come with that.
Scottish moral sense philosophy.
Scottish moral sense.
He believed in the heart rather than the head. That the heart was what made you human, rather than the head. By our standards, Jefferson was undeniably racist. He believed that blacks were human. They had the heart. They had the moral sense. They understood right from wrong. They were therefore human. But he was also, by our standards, racist. He felt they were an inferior sort of human. They didn't have the head that white people had until he met Benjamin Banneker, and then he kind of had a few changes there. But the point is that he couldn't figure out a way to resolve slavery without violence, without some kind of violence. And what Lincoln does is he comes in and ultimately he realized that the only way around Jefferson's dilemma, how do you get rid of slavery without violence, is to go through it, is to go through the violence.
So the dilemma is how do you get rid of it without violence?
Mm-hmm. And what Lincoln realized was that there was no way to do that. That you had to do the violence.
Sometimes you just have to chop the knot.
And by the time you get to the Civil War, Lincoln didn't get into the Civil War to end slavery. And he has this wonderful line, I think it's Horace Greeley, where he says, look, if I am here to preserve the Union. If I can preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, I will do that. If I can preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I will do that. And if I can preserve the Union by freeing some of the slaves and leaving others alone, I will do that. He was there to preserve the Union. And it's not really until he gets a year or two into the Civil War that he realizes, look, we're already in the worst case scenario. You've already got a Civil War. It's chewing up thousands and thousands of lives. It's destroying property. There's no worst case scenario worse than this. This is it. This is Jefferson's worst case scenario. Might as well punch it through. And
the other way to look at it is if you have a dilemma and you don't solve it, you are solving it you're just making it worse. By
Yeah.
not addressing it, you're actually going in the opposite direction, and the situation disintegrates.
And that's what happened. It never got resolved in the early 1800s. It got postponed with the Missouri Compromise, and then it gets that sort of gets aggravated through the 1840s, and then you get the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially
Which we, of
repeals.
course, we all know in Nebraska Act.
But what it does is the pre-Civil War American politics is based on that Missouri Compromise, which basically allows us to sweep the whole slavery issue under the rug a little bit. And then it gets repealed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It sort of gets pulled back up to the surface, where suddenly you have to deal with it again, and you can't postpone it anymore, and then everything falls apart. And Lincoln is faced with this realization, look, we're already here. The violence is here, and the only way to save the Union is to get rid of slavery. You can't have, a house divided against itself cannot stand. That's one of his earlier realizations. Now is the opportunity. There's nothing to save anymore. Now you need to stop.
And now this was connected to Milton House and
the Milton
our
House.
area in general. So what is? Can you talk a little bit about the Janesville or southern Wisconsin connection to slavery or to Civil War?
Oh yeah, I have to say, one of the things that I found really wonderful about coming to this area. I'm not from this area. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and when you grow up in Philadelphia, you kind of have this myopic sense that history sort of peters out around the Ohio state line, and that everything west of that must be just journalism. And then I came here, and the history in this area is just wonderfully rich. There is an amazing amount of fascinating history in this area. And I started out at the Milton House. I got to be the executive director there in 2002. The Milton House is a documented Underground Railroad site. It's one of the very few such sites in the country. Because the Underground Railroad was illegal, and very few things were ever written down because you don't want to get caught. But people wrote stuff down. We actually have documentation. We can prove that it's an Underground Railroad site. And for that reason, it is a National Historic Landmark. It's in the same category as Independence Hall in Gettysburg and the Old North Church in Boston. This is big league. We have big league history here in Rock County. And you can go through and actually walk through the building where they were, and in the basement where the fugitive slaves were hiding, and through the tunnel. The tunnel is a little nicer now. They've made it more for the tourists, so you can actually walk through it instead of crawling on your hands and knees. But it's the same tunnel. You go through the cabin. And that's just one of the historic sites that's here in Rock County. You've got the Tallman House, where Abraham Lincoln slept, which is a jewel. If you live in Janesville and you haven't been to the Tallman House or the Milton House, you need to go. This is an astonishing amount of history here. And then once you're through that, you can go to Beckman Mill. You can go to the Beloit Historical Society. They have a number of buildings. You can go up to Edgerton to see the Sterling North House. There's a tremendous amount of history here. And I think that's one of the underutilized resources that we have in Rock County.
Well, that probably has there's something that happens then. Residents of Philadelphia probably don't go to Philadelphia museums quite as much as tourists do.
This is true. The locals never go. I mean, when my wife and I were first dating, I took her to Independence Hall, because you have to go. And they take you into these huge groups of 75 or 80 people, and they ask you, who here is local? And it's just me and one other guy. And I would bet you a month's salary that the one other guy had a guest from out of town, just like I did. And that's a shame, because you grow up around it, and it just becomes normal. The Milton House is just this thing that you drive by on 26, and that's a shame, because there's so much there. As a historian, I'm used to dealing with documents, and I talk about it in classes, and I've gotten, I'm a decent storyteller, but it's not the same as walking through it, to see it, to physically be able to be in the room. That's a whole different level of experience.
Okay.